The summer of 1680 wrapped Madrid in a suffocating heat that seemed to press against the chest like an invisible hand. Inside the labyrinthine halls of the Alcázar, the royal residence, the air itself felt exhausted, thick with lavender, rosewater, incense from the chapel, and something far less pleasant. Courtiers moved slowly, their silks sticking to damp skin, their faces shining with sweat. But the heat alone was not the cause of their discomfort. Whispers trailed like shadows in the corridors. "Her Highness approaches," one lady-in-waiting murmured, fanning herself furiously while another discreetly reached for a flask of perfumed water. The spray arced through the air, momentarily freshening the space with the sweetness of orange blossom. Yet the fragrance was powerless. Within moments, it was swallowed by another scent, one so insistent and sour it turned stomachs. At just 19, Princess Margarita Teresa, daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, his niece and later his queen, carried with her a burden no jewels or silks could mask. The stench that clung to her body was said to resemble rotting fish mixed with damp mildew, a cloying odor that drifted behind her like an omen. It was cruel, an outward sign of something deeper, the symptom of a bloodline knotted too tightly upon itself. Generations of uncles wed to nieces, cousins bound to cousins, all in the desperate attempt to preserve power and property within the House of Habsburg. The princess herself had become a living testament to the cost. From across the Grand Gallery, Diego Velázquez de Silva, the venerable court painter, watched her glide past. His eyes, clouded but still sharp with the memory of decades, had sketched this family through triumph and decline. He had painted them crowned, armored, robed in splendor, but also increasingly marked by deformity and fragility. Each generation bore the dynasty's legacy more vividly etched into their bones: the jutting jaw, the heavy lips, the sunken gaze, and now inexplicable maladies that even the most esteemed physicians could not cure. Velázquez remembered an old phrase he had once overheard whispered by the royal physician, Luis Marcato, "El precio de la pureza de sangre," the price of blood purity. The words had struck him then as poetry, a phrase that belonged to a tragic play, but time had proven them prophecy. Decades earlier, in 1605, Marcato had penned a treatise, Morbis Hereditaris, warning of the dangers of marrying too close within kin. His cautionary words had been quietly shelved, drowned out by the dynasty's obsession with keeping its sacred blood uncontaminated by outsiders. Now the evidence walked the corridors in silks and pearls, a young woman hiding tears behind a painted face, carrying the invisible weight of centuries on her fragile frame. The courtiers shifted as she passed, bowing dutifully while holding handkerchiefs delicately to their noses. The gesture was subtle, but it cut like a blade. Margarita's eyes flickered, just for an instant, with the awareness of her condition. She said nothing, for silence had been her only weapon since childhood. The Alcázar itself seemed to groan beneath this legacy. Its stones were cold and damp, even in summer, smelling faintly of mildew. Torches flickered along its walls, casting elongated shadows that trembled like omens. In this palace, built to symbolize the glory of Spain, the grandeur had begun to curdle into decay. Visitors noticed it. Ambassadors whispered it back to their kings. What was once the mightiest dynasty in Europe had become increasingly the subject of pity and of ridicule. Outside, beyond the walls, the city of Madrid was restless. Merchants complained of rising taxes, soldiers begged for pay, and farmers cursed poor harvests. Yet within the palace, the greatest fear was not rebellion or war, but the failing health of children who carried the crown's future. The dynasty had stretched its blood like glass pulled too thin, and now cracks were beginning to show. Velázquez, who had painted kings and queens as near divine figures, looked on Margarita Teresa with a quiet sorrow. His brush had once immortalized her as a radiant child in Las Meninas, surrounded by courtiers and bathed in light. Now he saw her grown, yet diminished, trapped in the prison of her body. To him, she was less a princess and more a symbol, a warning that dynastic pride could twist into a curse. In that heavy summer air, filled with lavender and decay, every whisper, every sidelong glance carried a truth no one dared to say aloud. The House of Habsburg was beginning to rot from within. And though the bells of Madrid still rang with pomp and ceremony, they told over a dynasty already haunted by its own mortality.
In the palace kitchens, far removed from the gilded halls, yet no less important to the survival of those within them, Maria stirred a steaming pot of herbs. She was one of the older cooks, her hands gnarled by years of labor, her back bent like a willow under the weight of service to 3 generations of Habsburgs. Around her, the kitchen clattered with knives, the crackle of fires, and the rhythmic pounding of pestles grinding herbs into powders. Yet Maria's task was not to feed the court's endless banquets. It was to concoct a remedy, or at least a disguise, for the young princess's curse. She muttered to herself as she crushed rosemary and thyme into a thick paste, mixing it with vinegar and honey. "Poor girl," she whispered, her voice lost in the hiss of boiling pots. "It's not her fault she was born like this." Maria had seen the court try every possible trick over the years: scented oils from Arabia, perfumes imported from Florence, baths infused with rare resins. None lasted more than an hour before the smell returned, stubborn as destiny. The door slammed open. A high steward entered, sweat darkening the edges of his doublet. "Hurry with that concoction," he barked, dabbing his brow with a kerchief. "Her Highness is about to receive the French ambassador." His voice carried the tremor of urgency. Everyone knew what hung in the balance. For the ambassador was no ordinary guest. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Marquis de Torcy, envoy of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, was already infamous in Madrid. Sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, he missed nothing. His reports back to Versailles painted the Spanish court in pitiless detail, chronicling every falter of their king, every defect of his heirs, every rumor that might be turned into a diplomatic weapon. Maria handed over the jar with a heavy sigh. "It will not last," she muttered. "Nothing ever does." A young page, barely into manhood, could not resist whispering to his companion as the steward passed. "No herb will cover that stench." His words hung in the air, like smoke, and just as quickly he regretted them. The steward's hand flashed, striking the boy hard across the cheek. "Mind your tongue. You speak of the royal blood of Spain." The boy lowered his head in shame, but the truth of his words lingered in every heart present. For this was the cruel paradox of the Habsburg dynasty. The more they clung to their pure blood, the more visible its corruption became. Courtiers dressed it in silks, cooks smothered it in herbs, physicians cloaked it with theories, but none could deny the stench that trailed Margarita Teresa, nor the frailty that racked her younger brother, Prince Carlos. Upstairs in her chambers, the princess endured the ministrations of her ladies-in-waiting. They dabbed her skin with the herbal paste, smeared powders along her neck, and laced her tightly into gowns embroidered with gold thread. The air grew thick with the competing scents of musk, cinnamon, and roses, a battlefield of fragrances locked in hopeless combat against something more primal. Margarita did not resist. She had learned to stand silent and still, to endure humiliation without a word. Her ladies worked with frantic precision, for they knew what this meeting meant. If the ambassador reported weakness, if France scented decay in Spain's ruling house, the consequences would echo across Europe. Every observation would be transformed into leverage at the negotiating table. Every sigh, every feint, every cruel whisper could become another weapon for Louis XIV. The world beyond the Alcázar was watching closely. Spain, once master of oceans and empires, was now weakened by wars, bankrupt coffers, and unrest in its colonies. France, ascendant and ambitious, loomed like a hawk circling a faltering dove. And in the balance stood the reputation of a 19-year-old princess who could not control her own body. In that sense, the jar of herbs passed from Maria's weary hands to the steward's trembling grip was more than medicine. It was a desperate defense, a shield of scent against humiliation, a shield that everyone knew would crack before long. The court prepared itself for the ambassador's entrance. Perfumed curtains were drawn open, silver candlesticks polished, and flowers scattered in porcelain vases to mask the air. Yet beneath the roses and the lavender,
Beneath the powder and the perfumes, the old, persistent odor lingered, a reminder, heavy and inescapable, that no artifice could conceal the dynasty's truth. And as the French envoy made his way through the corridors, every heart in the Alcazar beat with the same fear, that he would smell not just the princess, but the decay of Spain.
In the cool chambers of the Alcazar, away from the kitchens and their herbal fumes, Princess Margarita Teresa stood before a gilded Venetian mirror. The surface was clouded with age, its glass wavering slightly, as though even it recoiled from reflecting her image too clearly. A line of attendants circled around her like satellites, fastening jewels, pinning veils, and smoothing the folds of her gown. Their hands were quick and practiced, but their faces betrayed unease. Powder was brushed onto her pale skin until it seemed almost translucent. Rouge brightened her cheeks into an imitation of health, while a thin line of kohl sharpened her weary eyes. Pearls were arranged in her dark hair, gleaming like tiny drops of moonlight. To any stranger, it might have looked like a scene of splendor, a young princess being dressed for courtly magnificence. But to those within these walls, it was an act of war, a ritual disguise to mask the truth. Margarita's eyes, glistening with unshed tears, met her own reflection. The mirror gave no kindness. It returned to her the Habsburg jaw, prominent and heavy, her lips slightly protruding, her skin tinged with an unhealthy hue despite the layers of powder. Her beauty, once celebrated in childhood portraits, had been eclipsed by the unmistakable mark of her bloodline's decline. The ladies-in-waiting murmured reassurances in soft voices, but their words floated past her like distant bells. What could they say? That she was radiant? That no one would notice? Margarita knew better. She had heard the whispers since childhood, felt the subtle recoil of courtiers as she entered a room. The perfumes, the powders, the jewels, none of it mattered. Beneath the surface, she carried the weight of a dynasty unraveling in her very flesh. The chamberlain entered, bowing low, though his face was carefully composed to avoid betraying the distaste he felt. "Your Highness, the ambassador awaits." His tone was formal, but Margarita detected the faint hesitation in his voice, as though he too feared what this meeting might bring. She inhaled, shallow and cautious, for even her own breath felt heavy in her chest. Steadying herself, she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and summoned what she had been taught since birth, the pride of Habsburg. It was a fragile mask, held together by ritual and duty, but it was all she possessed. "Let him in," she ordered, her voice firmer than she felt. The attendants stepped back, their work complete, as the princess stood like a living statue, yet behind her reflection, behind the veil of powder and pearls, lay the silent tragedy of a young woman who had inherited not only a crown, but the decay of centuries. For in this palace, mirrors were not merely glass, they were instruments of truth, crueler than whispers, colder than physicians' reports. And this one reflected a dynasty adorned in gold, but rotting at its core.
In another wing of the sprawling Alcazar, far from the polished chambers where his sister braced herself for the ambassador, a boy sat hunched over a book. His name was Carlos, and though only 12 years old, he already carried the crushing title of Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish throne. The volume before him was heavy with ink and parchment, but the words swam meaninglessly across the page. His tutor, a weary scholar from Salamanca, leaned close, speaking with forced patience. "Your Majesty, let us try again," the man urged, pointing to the same line he had pointed to a dozen times before. Carlos blinked, his gaze wandering back and forth. His tongue, too large for his mouth, pressed awkwardly against his teeth as he attempted to form sounds. The result was a garbled murmur, broken syllables that bore little resemblance to the words on the page. His tutor sighed softly, concealing his despair. He had tried every method, recitation, repetition, even prayers whispered under his breath. But progress was fleeting, always swallowed up by the boy's afflictions. Carlos's body was a fragile prison. His jaw jutted forward, heavy and malformed, making speech difficult and chewing nearly impossible. His legs, bent from rickets, ached with every step, forcing him to shuffle rather than stride. Seizures came without warning, leaving him trembling on the cold marble floors while his attendants rushed to his side. He was prone to infections, to fevers that lingered dangerously, and to exhaustion that left him pale and glassy-eyed. Yet it was not only his body that betrayed him. Intellectually, Carlos lagged behind other boys his age. While they memorized scripture or debated philosophy, he struggled to sound out the simplest prayers. His mother, Queen Mariana, insisted to visitors that her son was bright, merely delicate. But the truth was clear to those who served him daily. The heir of Spain could barely read the very prayers that bound his crown to God. From the tall windows of his chamber, Carlos watched the gardens below. The laughter of noble children carried upward, sons of dukes and counts running freely across the lawns, chasing each other in mock battles with wooden swords. Their limbs were strong, their movements effortless, their shouts full of life. Carlos stared with something like longing, his small fingers tightening on the edge of his chair. He had never joined them, and he knew he never could. His legs would not carry him, his lungs would not permit it. He was bound to this ornate cage of tapestries and tutors, forever an observer of life rather than a participant. His tutor noticed the boy's eyes drifting and gently placed a hand on the book. "Highness, the words will not bite," he said with forced cheer. "Look once more." But Carlos did not look down. His gaze remained fixed on the children, on the world that seemed forever closed to him. The palace whispered of him constantly. Servants, courtiers, and even foreign envoys all speculated in hushed tones about his health, his mind, his very ability to live into manhood. Some pitied him, others scorned him, but none could ignore the truth. Spain's future rested on the shoulders of a child already broken by his inheritance. A fragile silence lingered in the chamber, broken only by the faint rustle of the book's pages and the distant echoes of laughter from the gardens below. It was a silence heavy with dread, for everyone who looked upon Carlos knew what they dared not say aloud. This boy, frail and faltering, was meant to wear the crown of the most powerful empire in the world. And even the simplest act, reading a line of scripture, was already beyond his grasp.
In the vaulted council chamber of the Alcazar, King Philip IV sat slouched in his carved oak chair, his once commanding figure worn thin by years of war and governance. The candlelight exaggerated the hollows of his cheeks and the deep grooves etched across his brow. Before him lay a table heavy with maps, ledgers, and petitions, all reminders of an empire in decline. War with France had drained Spain's coffers, leaving the treasury gasping for silver. The riches of the New World still arrived in convoys of galleons, but piracy, storms, and corruption had bled them nearly dry. Revolts smoldered in Naples and Catalonia, while in the Americas, restlessness among colonists and indigenous rebellions gnawed at Spain's distant authority. The vast empire, once invincible, seemed now like a giant staggering under its own weight. Yet for Philip, none of these troubles pressed more heavily on his mind than the matter of succession. Around him, his ministers spoke with urgency, their voices echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. "Your Majesty must consider a marriage for Prince Carlos," urged the Duke of Medina de las Torres, the Prime Minister, his voice both firm and anxious. "He is young, yes, but the future of the dynasty depends upon securing the succession without delay." Others nodded in agreement, scribes already poised with quills to record the king's reply. Philip stroked his graying beard, his eyes fixed on the table though his thoughts drifted far beyond it. He had heard the same counsel before. The ministers spoke as though marriage were a simple solution, as though a bride could be found, vows spoken, and heirs produced by sheer force of will. But Philip carried a secret, whispered only in private by his most trusted physicians. They had examined Carlos. They had seen the malformed jaw, the sluggish mind, the frail body that buckled under the smallest exertion. They had spoken quietly of conditions no physician could name with certainty. Perhaps hypogonadism, they suggested. Perhaps sterility. Perhaps no child would ever be conceived by this fragile heir. Philip's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. He said nothing of this to his counsel. To voice such doubts aloud would be to admit what he feared most, that his dynasty, centuries in the making, might end with the boy he had placed all hope upon. "Consider the royal houses of France, Austria, and Portugal," he said at last, his voice steady but hollow. "Bring before me a list of suitable candidates. The matter will be weighed carefully." The ministers bowed, satisfied for now, but as they murmured among themselves and the scribes scratched at their parchments, Philip leaned back in silence. His mind wandered not to charts or treaties, but to the faces of his children. Margarita Teresa, who fainted so easily, her health as fragile as porcelain. Carlos, whose body seemed a cruel mockery of kingship. And behind them both, the spectral figure of Mariana of Austria, his wife and niece, whose marriage to him had been hailed as a triumph of dynastic purity. Purity. The word tasted bitter now. What use was pure blood if it produced children too weak to live, too frail to rule? He had once believed the marriage wise, expedient, even ordained by God. But God's favor seemed to have turned elsewhere. The chamber grew stifling, the air thick with candle smoke and the murmur of men who spoke of dynasties as though they were ledgers to be balanced. Philip's gaze fell on a crucifix on the wall, its shadow stretching long across the chamber. For a moment he wondered whether the suffering of his children was not merely the result of policy, but of sin. The sin of pride, the sin of defying nature in the name of power. He said no more. The council continued its chatter of alliances and marriages, of treaties and dowries, but the king sat in silence, the weight of his crown pressing heavier than iron, for he knew what none of them dared to speak, that no matter what bride they found, Spain's future rested on the shoulders of a boy who might never be a man.
The sound of hurried footsteps broke through the drone of the council. A messenger, flushed and breathless, entered the chamber and fell to one knee before the king. In his trembling hands, he carried a sealed letter, the wax still warm from the courier's press. Philip tore it open with unsteady fingers, his eyes scanning the words in silence. A hush fell across the room as the king's face blanched. He exhaled slowly, then spoke in a voice that seemed to crack under its own weight. "There has been an incident. The audience with the French ambassador was interrupted. The Princess Margarita Teresa fainted." Gasps echoed around the table. Though not the first time she had collapsed in public, each episode carried with it a fresh wave of dread. Ministers exchanged glances heavy with unspoken truth. The king's daughter was as fragile as her brother. Philip rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "Adjourn the meeting," he muttered, his voice weary. Without waiting for response, he left the chamber, his robes dragging like shadows behind him. The corridors of the Alcázar stretched endlessly before him, their stone walls damp and dark even in summer. Tapestries depicting the triumphs of Spain's past, victories in Italy, the conquest of the Americas, fleets of galleons braving storm and sea, hung heavy on the walls. Once they had filled Philip with pride. Now, as he passed beneath their woven banners, he felt only the sting of irony. For what use were past triumphs when the blood meant to carry that legacy forward was poisoned from within? His steps echoed through the hallway as memories pressed against his mind.
He had once stood tall and proud, marrying Mariana of Austria, his own niece, after the death of his first wife. The union had been praised as politically brilliant. It bound Austria and Spain more tightly, kept power concentrated within the Habsburg name, ensured no rival house would dilute their claim to greatness. He had believed it wise, even necessary. But wisdom, he realized now, had a cruel face. He saw it in his daughter, wilting beneath layers of powder and perfume. He saw it in his son, struggling to pronounce simple words, his body too weak to stand among other children. And he felt it most keenly in his own heart, where guilt weighed heavier than any crown. He had not merely fathered children, he had condemned them to fragile bodies and short lives, condemned them to carry the consequences of decisions made generations before. The practice of marrying kin had always been framed as duty, as loyalty to blood, as God's will. But what if it was pride masquerading as piety? What if it was not divine protection they had sought, but a defiance of the natural order itself? As Philip neared Margarita's chambers, his steps slowed. He dreaded what he might see, his daughter pale and faint, her eyes pleading silently with him, asking why she had been made to suffer this way. He had no answer to give her. How could he tell her that her suffering was the cost of empire, that her weakness was not hers alone, but the dynasty's? The king paused before her door, his hand pressed against the carved wood. For a moment, he was not a monarch, but a father broken beneath the weight of choices that could not be undone. And as the muffled sound of attendance reached his ears, he closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "Not a prayer, not a command, but a confession. I have doomed them." The words were swallowed by the silence of the palace, but within Philip's chest they echoed like a tolling bell, marking not just the decline of his children, but the slow, inevitable collapse of a dynasty.
Deep within the Alcazar, far from the ambassador's reception and the echo of courtly whispers, a solitary candle flickered in the royal library. The air smelled of dust and old parchment, the silence broken only by the rustle of pages turned by anxious hands. Here sat one of the king's physicians, his face drawn with fatigue, his eyes scanning ancient texts as though salvation might lie hidden between their lines. He had been summoned many times to the royal chambers, to prescribe remedies, to mix draughts of herbs and minerals, to recommend pilgrimages and prayers. Yet all his efforts, and those of his predecessors, had dissolved into failure. Now, desperate, he returned to the words of men long dead. Luis Marcato's treatise, Morbus Hereditarius, lay open before him. The physician traced a line with his trembling finger. The repeated union of blood too close in kin produces fragile offspring, prone to illness, disfigurement, and, in the worst cases, incapable of reproduction. The words struck him with the weight of prophecy. Marcato had written them decades earlier, at the dawn of the 17th century, when the Habsburgs still seemed unassailable. His warnings had been whispered, then dismissed, then forgotten. But now, in the faint light of the candle, they returned like an accusation. The physician leaned back in his chair, listening to the faint thunder that rolled beyond the palace walls. It was as though the heavens themselves echoed what he read, nature's judgment upon a family that had defied her laws. He was not alone in his search. Throughout Europe, physicians debated furiously. Some clung to the humoral theory, that sickness arose from imbalances of blood, bile, and phlegm. They prescribed leeches, purges, and endless bleeding. Others, influenced by new currents from Italy and France, began to suspect that illness might pass through families like a shadow, inherited as surely as hair color or stature. These were dangerous thoughts, whispered in secrecy. For to suggest that a dynasty's very blood was corrupt was to challenge the foundation of monarchy itself. Still, the evidence was undeniable. The Habsburg jaw, so pronounced that some kings could scarcely chew, the slow minds, the bent spines, the frail bodies, and now the odor that clung to Margarita Teresa like a curse. It was all of a piece, each symptom a thread in the same tapestry of decline. The physician closed the treatise softly, his hands resting on its worn cover. There were no cures in these pages, only warnings that had gone unheeded. Yet he could not speak these truths aloud. To do so would be to brand himself a traitor, an enemy of the very family he was sworn to serve. So he wrote cautiously in his own notes, cloaking his words in the language of observation rather than accusation. The heirs show signs of hereditary weakness. Remedies are of limited effect. The malady is not of humors, but of structure. He paused, dipping his quill again. The candle sputtered. Beyond the library walls, the court prepared its spectacles, its perfumes, its masks. But here, in the solitude of ink and silence, the physician knew what none dared to say, that the sickness of the Habsburgs was not an illness to be cured. It was a destiny to be endured. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. When he opened them again, the candle flame shivered, throwing long, spidery shadows across the shelves. He felt in that moment like one of those shadows himself, an invisible witness, powerless against the tide of history. And as the storm gathered outside, he wondered whether it was not God, but nature itself, that had passed judgment on Spain.
The bells of Madrid rang solemnly on a cool November day in 1679. Their sound echoed across the city's narrow streets, calling nobles, clergy, and foreign envoys to the Cathedral of Santa Maria la Real de la Almudena. It was no ordinary service. Spain's frail young king, Carlos II, not yet 18, was to take a bride. His chosen consort was Maria Luisa of Orleans, the spirited 17-year-old niece of King Louis XIV of France. For weeks, Madrid had been decorated with banners and flowers, the streets lined with curious citizens hoping to glimpse their queen-to-be. But within the palace, whispers circulated with cruel speed. It was said the French princess had wept bitterly upon first laying eyes on her husband. Who could blame her? Carlos, despite the best efforts of his attendants, looked less like a king and more like a figure sculpted by misfortune. His body was thin to the point of emaciation. His Habsburg jaw had grown so heavy and protruding that his mouth could not fully close, leaving him with a vacant expression and a constant dribble of saliva that attendants discreetly dabbed away. His tongue was too large for his mouth, his speech high-pitched and nearly incomprehensible. To keep him upright through the ceremony, 2 aides supported him discreetly under the arms. The cathedral, vast and echoing, seemed to hold its breath as the ritual unfolded. Cardinal Portocarrero presided, his voice sonorous, though trembling slightly as he addressed the couple before him. When it came time for Carlos to speak his vows, silence thickened in the chamber. The young king opened his mouth, stammered, and produced words so garbled that only those standing nearest could discern them. A murmur passed through the congregation, a ripple of discomfort disguised as reverence. In one of the pews near the front, Doña Elvira de Montoya, a noblewoman well into her 70s, leaned close to her granddaughter. "Look at his hands," she whispered. The girl, glancing discreetly, saw fingers trembling as Carlos fumbled to guide the wedding ring onto Maria Luisa's hand. "Do you think he can have children?" the girl asked softly. Doña Elvira frowned at her boldness, yet the question echoed the unspoken thoughts of everyone in the cathedral. For in truth, the survival of Spain's crown now rested on this fragile boy's ability to sire an heir. The empire's future, its armies, its colonies, its treasure fleets, was bound to a body that seemed already close to collapse. Maria Luisa stood gracefully, her French training evident in her composure. She smiled faintly, her face pale but controlled, her eyes betraying only the faintest flicker of dread. She had been raised for this role, schooled in the duties of a royal bride, yet nothing had prepared her for the reality of her husband, a king in title, a broken boy in truth. At the very front of the church, Queen Mariana of Austria watched with a face carved from stone. She had ruled as regent during her son's long minority, and she intended to remain the power behind the throne. But her gaze on Maria Luisa was sharp, suspicious. To Mariana, the French bride was not merely a young woman, but a Trojan horse, an agent of Bourbon ambition brought across the Pyrenees. At the back of the cathedral, Count Harrach, the Austrian ambassador, observed with keen attention. He would later report to Vienna with brutal honesty. The king can hardly remain on his feet. His weakness is such that it is doubtful he will ever consummate the marriage, let alone produce an heir. As the vows were completed and the bells pealed once more, the congregation erupted in formal applause. Trumpets blared, choirs sang, and the cathedral filled with the grandeur expected of a royal wedding. Yet beneath the ceremony, beneath the solemn prayers and glittering vestments, there lingered an unshakable awareness. This was not the beginning of renewal for Spain. It was the staging of a fragile hope that the union of a broken king and a reluctant bride might miraculously defy nature. As the procession left the cathedral, sunlight breaking briefly through the November clouds, all of Madrid cheered. But behind the cheers lay an unspoken truth. The future of the empire had just been placed in the hands of a boy who could barely place a ring on his wife's hand.
At the head of the cathedral, seated in her place of honor, Queen Mariana of Austria observed the wedding with an expression of icy composure. To the casual eye, she was a grieving widow, a dutiful mother, a queen who bore the weight of her son's frailty with stoic dignity. But to those who knew her, Mariana was far more than that. She was the real power behind the throne, had been since Carlos was a child of 4, too weak and too feeble to rule alone. Mariana herself was both a product and a defender of the dynasty's obsession with blood purity. She was the daughter of Ferdinand III, Emperor of Austria, the sister of Philip IV, and eventually his wife. She had spent her entire life within the Habsburg circle, bound by its logic, its politics, its pride. To her, marrying within the family was not simply tradition, it was destiny. And though the cost of that destiny could now be seen in her son's fragile body, she clung to it with iron conviction. Her eyes shifted to Maria Luisa of Orleans, the new queen, standing beside Carlos with the calm poise of her French upbringing. Mariana studied her as one might study an adversary. Maria Luisa was not just a bride, she was a Bourbon, a niece of Louis XIV, the most ambitious monarch in Europe, whose long shadow stretched over the Pyrenees. To Mariana, she represented danger, French influence creeping into Madrid through silken veils and whispered prayers. The Queen Mother's disapproval was not hidden. Courtiers watched the tension carefully, whispering among themselves. Could Maria Luisa win Mariana's favor, or would she be crushed beneath the weight of her mother-in-law's suspicion? Few doubted the answer. Mariana had spent nearly 2 decades mastering the delicate balance of court factions. She played clerics against nobles, ministers against foreign ambassadors, bending them all to her will. Her rule had not been free of scandal. Accusations of corruption and favoritism dogged her regency, but she had endured. Now, she intended to endure still.
As the ceremony drew to a close, Mariana's mind worked with relentless calculation. She thought of alliances, of whispers from Vienna, of how the Austrian Habsburgs looked upon Spain's decline with both alarm and opportunity. She considered how France, through Maria Louisa, might press its advantage, manipulating her weak son into policies that served the Sun King. No, she thought, that could not be allowed. Carlos may wear the crown, Maria Louisa may sit beside him, but the true authority of Spain would remain with her. Her eyes shifted to her son, pale, trembling, barely able to stand. A pang of something softer stirred in her heart. She loved him, in her way, but she also pitied him. He was both king and child, burden and blessing, a fragile vessel carrying the destiny of Spain. He needed her, and she would not let him go, no matter how many crowns or brides stood beside him. In the pews, courtiers bent their heads, murmuring prayers for the young couple. But Mariana's silent prayer was different. It was not for her son's strength, nor for her new daughter-in-law's happiness. It was for power, Habsburg power, to remain intact, guarded by her hands, guided by her will, even as the bloodline itself faltered. For in her mind, she was not merely the Queen Mother. She was Spain's regent still.
After the wedding vows were spoken and the cathedral emptied of incense and solemn hymns, the royal procession returned to the Alcázar for the feast. Long tables had been set in the great hall, groaning under the weight of roasted venison, pheasant, boar, exotic fruits from the Indies, and silver platters piled high with sugared almonds and candied citrus. Musicians tuned their lutes in the gallery above, waiting to unleash melodies of joy. The occasion demanded splendor. Spain was still a kingdom of ceremony, even if its strength had begun to falter. At the center of it all sat the young king, yet Carlos II was no radiant bridegroom. Exhausted by the ceremony, his body sagged into the high-backed chair, his pale face glistening with sweat. He poked listlessly at his food, unable to chew the roasted meats that had been prepared in his honor. His malformed jaw made eating painful, and so he sipped weak broths and soft purees, while his courtiers pretended not to notice. At his side, Maria Louisa of Orleans maintained the poise drilled into her since childhood. She smiled faintly, lifting her goblet when required, murmuring polite words to her new husband in French-accented Spanish, yet her eyes often dropped to her plate, and her fingers fidgeted with the lace at her sleeve. She had been raised on tales of Spain's grandeur, its vast empire and golden cities across the ocean, but the man beside her was not the image of that empire. He was its warning, its slow unraveling. The hall glittered with candlelight, but beneath the brilliance lay unease. Foreign envoys watched closely, their eyes sharp as hawks. They studied the king's trembling hands, the way his head lolled when fatigue overtook him, the way his attendants leaned in discreetly to assist him. To them, the wedding was not a union of hearts, but a ledger of strength and weakness. At the high table, the Duke of Medina de las Torres leaned toward the Constable of Castile, his voice low but heavy with meaning. Look how the foreign dignitaries stare at him, like vultures circling a dying beast. The constable gave a grim nod. Both men knew what the world suspected, that Spain's crown, immense though it seemed, might soon slip from the Habsburgs' grasp. Across the Pyrenees, Louis XIV was already weaving a web of alliances, preparing for the day when Spain's throne would be vacant and Europe's balance of power would shatter. The music began, gentle at first, filling the silence with sweet distraction. Courtiers rose to dance, their silks flashing like jewels as they spun across the polished floor. Yet many glanced back
toward the royal couple, noting how stiffly Carlos sat, how rarely he spoke, how forced Maria Luisa's smile appeared. Beneath the gilded chandeliers, appearances were maintained, but behind them the truth whispered louder than any melody. In a corner of the hall, foreign envoys whispered in Latin and French, their reports already forming in their minds. The king is frail. The king is weak. The king may never produce an heir. Each observation would soon be dispatched across Europe, to Vienna, to Versailles, to London, feeding the ambitions of rival dynasties. The Duke of Medina de las Torres leaned back in his chair, his expression dark. "He sees what we see," he murmured to no one in particular, "the end of a line." As the feast continued, laughter and music filled the hall, but to those with ears attuned to politics, the sound was hollow. Spain's nobles drank and danced, but their eyes, like those of the foreign guests, returned again and again to their fragile king, a pale figure at the center of splendor, a symbol of decay dressed in velvet and gold. And in that moment, beneath the roar of merriment, a darker truth whispered through the hall. The empire's future was not being celebrated. It was being measured, weighed, and already prepared for division.
As night drew its veil over Madrid, the Alcazar's great hall dimmed, the music softening, the dancers retreating. Candles guttered low in silver sconces, while servants cleared the remains of the feast. Half-finished dishes of meat, platters of fruits left untouched by the king. Yet while the court's revelry waned, the night's true test was only beginning. The consummation of the marriage loomed. For ordinary couples it was private, hidden within the sanctity of the bedchamber. For kings and queens it was ritual, nearly ceremonial, and heavy with expectation. Spain's destiny, whispered in the corridors, rested not in battles or treaties, but in whether a frail young man and his French bride could produce an heir. Carlos II, pale and exhausted from the day's ordeal, was gently guided away from the hall by his gentlemen in waiting. They undressed him with care, not merely out of respect, but because his trembling hands and weakened limbs made even the simplest tasks difficult. Perfumed oils were dabbed upon his thin body, and another potion, this one spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and so-called aphrodisiacs from the Indies, was pressed to his lips. He swallowed without protest, though his eyes seemed distant, dazed as though he were more specter than man. Elsewhere in the palace, Maria Luisa was being prepared by her ladies. They removed her gown layer by layer, combed her hair, and anointed her with rosewater. One of them, the Duchess of Terranova, leaned close, whispering in a voice low but urgent, "Remember, Majesty, Spain's future rests on tonight." The words were meant to steady her, but they fell like a sentence of doom. Maria Luisa nodded, though her chest tightened with dread. She had been raised in the glittering court of Versailles, schooled in duty, aware that a royal bride's body was not her own, but an instrument of politics. Yet nothing in her lessons had prepared her for this, to lie beside a husband whose very body seemed broken by destiny, whose touch was shadowed by illness. In a small chapel adjoining the palace, monks prayed fervently. Their voices rose in chants that mingled with the night air, imploring heaven for strength, for fertility, for divine intervention. Father Mateo de Moya, the king's confessor, knelt longest. He knew Carlos's torment well, the boy's whispered confessions of fear and inadequacy, his shame at failing even the simplest duties expected of a man, let alone a king. "Grant our sovereign the strength, O Lord," the priest whispered, his brow pressed to the cold stone. Yet even as he prayed, a darker thought crept unbidden. What if the king's weakness was not a test from God, but his judgment? In the shadows of the palace, rumors festered. Servants spoke in hushed tones about the king's body, about whether he was capable of performing the act that all of Europe awaited. Some swore he was too weak. Others claimed he was malformed, incapable of fathering children at all.
These whispers spread like wildfire, carrying with them the heavy scent of inevitability. And so, as midnight approached, the royal couple was led through the corridors toward their nuptial chamber. Courtiers lingered outside, straining to hear any sign, though decorum demanded silence. The action scene was treated as a public affair, the bedchamber a stage upon which the future of Spain would either be secured or revealed as hopeless. Maria Luisa lay still, her heart pounding as the door closed behind them. Carlos, frail and trembling, approached as attendants withdrew. Two lives, bound not by love but by dynastic desperation, faced one another in silence. Beyond the walls, prayers murmured, whispers spread, and in the hearts of those who waited, one truth loomed larger than any ceremony. The fate of an empire rested on a night that might never succeed.
While courtiers gossiped in corners and priests whispered prayers to heaven, another figure bent low over parchment in a lamplit study. Dr. Juan Bautista Juanini, one of the royal physicians, scribbled with quick strokes of his quill, his eyes flicking constantly toward the door as though he feared his words might be overheard. Unlike many of his colleagues, Juanini had studied the new medical thinking rising in Italy and France. He had walked the lecture halls of Padua, where anatomy was beginning to be studied not as a mystical balance of humors, but as a system of structure and cause. He had corresponded with physicians who dared to cut into corpses and map the body with an eye as sharp as a cartographer's. In Madrid, however, such ideas were regarded with suspicion, too modern, too radical, too dangerous to the stability of the throne. Still, Juanini wrote boldly, "The king's ailment is neither spiritual nor humoral. It is structural. It is the result of repeated unions within kin, each generation concentrating defects rather than dispersing them." The words seemed to glow like fire on the page. They were true, and he knew it. Carlos's frailty was not a matter of evil spirits, nor the imbalance of hot and cold in his blood. It was written into his very body. The twisted jaw, the weak limbs, the seizures, all of them were nature's cruel arithmetic, the inevitable sum of centuries of dynastic pride. Juanini dipped his quill again, his hand shaking slightly. He had tried remedies, infusions of herbs, mineral tonics, exotic elixirs carried from across the oceans. He had applied the logic of Galen and the whispers of alchemists, even permitted rituals of exorcism when priests demanded them. Nothing endured, nothing healed. The king remained as frail as ever. He looked at his notes and felt it chill. He was a physician, sworn to heal, yet he stood powerless. For how could one heal a dynasty that had chosen its own poison, binding itself so tightly that the blood could no longer breathe? Outside, the corridors still echoed with murmurs of the nuptial night. Courtiers speculated, nobles prayed, servants traded rumors. Would Spain awaken tomorrow with news of consummation or with whispers of failure? Juanini, more than any of them, already knew the likely truth. The odds were written not in tonight's chamber, but in the centuries that had come before. He closed his journal softly, extinguishing his candle. The shadows closed in, heavy and suffocating. For him, the matter was settled. What others called weakness, he called inheritance. What others prayed against, he called inevitability. Yet he also knew this truth could never be spoken aloud. To say it would be to accuse the Habsburgs of authoring their own destruction. To say it would be to turn medicine into treason. So he walked from his chamber into the night, silent, his journal tucked beneath his arm. Spain would continue its rituals, its prayers, its desperate remedies. But deep within, he carried the knowledge that the dynasty's decline was not a curse, nor a test, nor the will of God. It was science, too new for his age to understand,
too terrible for his king to bear.
The nuptial night passed, but its silence echoed louder than any trumpet. Whispers spread through the Alcazar like a contagion. The marriage had not been consummated. Some claimed the young queen wept behind her chamber doors, others that the king had been seen leaving pale and trembling, his robes disheveled in a way that suggested not passion but humiliation. At first, courtiers reassured themselves with hopeful words. The king is young, his health delicate. In time, strength will come. God will bless their union with children. But as days turned to months, the truth refused to soften. The queen bloomed with beauty, yet her womb remained empty. The king grew no stronger, no more capable of fulfilling his most sacred duty, to give Spain an heir. In the candlelit chapels of Madrid, priests raised their voices in special masses, imploring heaven for a miracle. Relics were paraded through the streets, their jeweled casings glinting in the sun, while barefoot penitents lashed their backs bloody in hopes of stirring divine mercy. Pilgrimages were organized, prayers were whispered into the night, and offerings piled high upon holy altars. Yet the heavens remained silent. Behind closed doors, the desperation grew darker. Physicians were summoned from Italy, from Flanders, even from the New World. Each came bearing promises, potions of exotic herbs, aphrodisiacs brewed from rare animals, powders ground from strange minerals. Some claimed they could strengthen the royal seed, others that they could rouse passion in a body dulled by sickness. None succeeded. The queen, once patient, began to wither with frustration. She was watched at every hour, her body measured, her cycles noted, her behavior scrutinized as if she were livestock to be bred. She was expected to smile, to reassure, to play the role of the fertile consort. Yet in her private chambers she raged in silence, her youthful spirit stifled beneath the suffocating weight of expectation. And always, in the shadows, the courtiers whispered. Some dared to suggest annulment, a second marriage, a new bride who might succeed where Margarita had failed. Others, bolder still, hinted that perhaps the fault lay not with the queen, but with the king himself. But to speak it too loudly was to risk one's head, for it was treason to admit aloud what everyone knew in secret. The blood of the Habsburgs had withered beyond repair. The king meanwhile grew weaker. Fevers struck him often, leaving him bedridden for weeks. He suffered seizures that left his body twisted and his speech slurred. Some said he was bewitched, cursed by enemies of Spain. Others whispered that it was the devil himself who had taken root within him. But those who knew the truth, the physicians, the midwives, the attendants, watched in despair, understanding that this was not sorcery, but heredity. And so Spain lingered in a state of waiting, of trembling hope, of gnawing dread. Each new month carried the same prayer, that the queen might at last carry life in her womb. And each month ended with the same silence, the same grief. It was not only the failure of a man or a marriage, it was the slow unraveling of a dynasty. For as the royal marriage remained barren, so too did the future of Spain.
The Spanish court moved as if under a funeral veil. While tapestries still glittered in candlelight and courtiers bowed with polished grace, the silence beneath the surface was heavy. All eyes circled around one frail figure, the king, Charles II. By now he had grown into manhood, but his body betrayed him at every turn. His gait was uneven, his steps uncertain. He could not mount a horse without assistance, nor lift a sword without trembling. His tongue struggled with words, so much so that ambassadors privately recorded how painful it was to hear him speak, his sentences breaking apart in stammers and gasps. Yet what unsettled the court most was not his weakness, but his shadow. The king's face bore the unmistakable Habsburg jaw, so pronounced it seemed carved in stone, his lips heavy and protruding. His eyes, though pale and watery, had a strange intensity, as if he saw things invisible to others. Servants whispered that he often spoke of spirits, of voices in the dark, of dreams that clung to him even in daylight. Some dismissed it as sickness of the brain. Others, more superstitious, claimed the boy was cursed, his soul caught between worlds. Whenever he appeared in public, the people stared in a mixture of pity and dread. Mothers clutched their children closer. Priests urged their congregations to pray harder. For though he was the king, the most Catholic majesty, defender of Christendom, he seemed less like a ruler and more like a living omen of decline. Behind palace doors, debates raged. The Council of State circled around the same questions week after week. Could the king govern? Could he sire children? Could Spain endure? They wrote reports laced with caution, never daring to state outright the truth that gnawed at them all, that Charles was little more than a shadow of a king. And yet, despite his fragility, he was the axis upon which all of Spain turned. Without him, there was no heir. Without him, there was no certainty. The queen, Margarita Teresa, played her part beside him, though her patience thinned as the years stretched on. She bore the public mask of loyalty, yet in private her heart grew heavy. She was chained not only to a husband, but to a shadow that haunted every corner of the palace. The court physicians, grave men with tired eyes, recorded his symptoms in meticulous Latin. Seizures, impotence, fevers, melancholia. They prescribed bleeding, purges, tinctures brewed from strange roots, yet nothing restored vigor to the king. His body, weakened by centuries of inbreeding, resisted all remedies. And so the court carried on, a theater of ceremony. Golden processions still marched through Madrid. Bells still rang for feast days. Yet beneath the incense and the chants, Spain lived in fear of what would follow when the shadow of the king finally vanished. For Charles II was not merely a sick man. He was the last flicker of a great house, a candle burning low, its wax nearly gone. And everyone who watched him knew, when that light died, darkness would descend upon Spain.
Queen Margarita Teresa carried her crown like a stone on her brow. To the people of Madrid, she was still a vision of grace, the golden-haired daughter of Austria, who had once been painted by Velázquez as a radiant child. Yet behind the velvet curtains, her life was far from a portrait of splendor. Her husband, Charles II, was a man-child, trapped in frailty, and she, still young, bore the crushing weight of a kingdom on her shoulders. Court etiquette demanded that she smile, curtsy, and whisper words of encouragement at her husband's side. But in private, the silence between them stretched into vast, unbridgeable chasms. He could not give her children. He could not give her strength. What remained between them was duty, and duty alone. The physicians, desperate, often laid blame upon the queen herself. They whispered that perhaps she was barren, that her womb had been cursed. Rumors swirled like smoke through the palace corridors. Rumors not only of infertility, but of witchcraft. Some claimed that the queen was the victim of enchantments, that dark spells bound her womb shut. Others, more venomous, accused her of harboring the witchcraft herself, of being an agent of doom to Spain. She bore it with the dignity she had been trained to master since childhood. But in the solitude of her chambers, she wept. She prayed before the Virgin, kneeling on cold stone floors until her knees ached, begging for deliverance, for a child, for a sign, for the salvation of her house. The burden extended beyond her body.
Ministers came to her in secret, entreating her to intervene in matters of state, to soften the king's decisions, or to give them voice when Charles faltered. She became not just queen, but shield, buffer, interpreter of a king who was drifting ever further into weakness. Her signature, though hidden in shadows, carried weight in the affairs of empire. Yet no matter how skillfully she played her role, one truth gnawed at her. She was trapped. Trapped in a marriage forged by dynasties, trapped in a palace suffocating with incense and intrigue, trapped in a body that bore no heir. She had been born to preserve the Habsburg line, but each year that passed without a child only deepened the wound of her failure. In those quiet moments, she would gaze out the narrow windows of the Alcazar toward the streets of Madrid. She watched the people bow as processions passed, their faces lit with hope, never knowing the despair that lived inside their palace. To them, she was a queen blessed by heaven. To herself, she was a vessel that had not fulfilled its purpose.
The Spanish court was never short of shadows, but in the reign of Charles II, those shadows grew claws. Whenever the king faltered, when his body convulsed in seizures, when his speech slurred into incoherence, when his breath rattled in the night, the explanation was no longer medical, it was supernatural. The courtiers whispered of hechiceria, of spells woven against the king. Priests muttered of demons nesting within his body, gnawing at his soul. Physicians, powerless before the king's decline, found refuge in the language of curses. After all, how could natural illness explain such unnatural weakness? How could a king born of so many royal bloodlines be reduced to a trembling shell of flesh unless dark forces were at work? Soon, the accusations began. Fingers pointed not only at enemies abroad, but within the palace itself. The queen, Margarita Teresa, though outwardly dutiful, became the subject of venomous rumor. Some claimed she was barren not by nature, but by malefic design, that she had been hexed. Others went further, accusing her of harboring witches in her retinue, of letting spells seep into the king's very chamber. One name arose again and again, Maria de Agreda, a mystic nun who had long been venerated for her visions. Though she had died years before, her prophecies lingered in courtly memory. Some declared she had foretold Charles's afflictions, others that her writings concealed knowledge of how to purge him. The line between sainthood and sorcery blurred, as it always did in desperate times. The king himself was not spared these fears. Servants swore they heard him muttering to unseen presences, that he recoiled from shadows as if they reached for him. He confessed to confessors that he felt bound, ensnared, poisoned by invisible chains. Exorcists were summoned, holy water sprinkled, relics pressed against his failing body. Yet none of it worked. Each ritual left him weaker, as though the demons, if demons they were, mocked the church itself. Every failure only fueled the whispers louder. The king is cursed! The king is bewitched! For Spain, this fear became more than superstition. It became political. If Charles were truly ensorcelled, then the kingdom's collapse was not only natural, but divinely ordained. It gave ministers, nobles, and foreign envoys alike reason to prepare for the inevitable, the day when Spain's crown would slip from the Habsburgs forever. And so, the palace, heavy with incense and prayer, became a theater of suspicion. Behind every curtain lurked the suspicion of witchcraft. Behind every faltering breath of the king lingered the terror that Spain itself was under a spell. The question that remained was not whether the curse was real,
but whether it could be broken.
The Spanish court, suffocating under its own rituals and fears, turned more and more to prophecy. When reason failed, when medicine stumbled, the future was sought in omens, in visions, in the trembling words of mystics who claimed to pierce the veil of heaven. Prophecies had always walked beside the Habsburgs. Astrologers whispered at births, monks warned of eclipses, and seers declared destinies that kings dared not ignore. But for Charles II, prophecy became a chain. His very life was framed not by deeds, but by predictions. The most famous of them all was the warning that Charles would be the last of his line. It was said that before his birth, holy men had cautioned that Spain's dynasty, heavy with too much blood mingled in itself, would end with him. That he was not born to continue the Habsburgs, but to close their book. The court could not resist searching for signs to confirm it. When storms broke across Madrid, when the sun was swallowed by clouds, when comets streaked across the night sky, each event was interpreted as heaven's judgment upon the king. Even his frail body was read as a prophecy made flesh, a dynasty devouring itself. Charles himself lived under this shadow. He was told from childhood that evil forces plagued him, that his suffering was not only his own, but Spain's. Priests instructed him that he bore the sins of generations, that his life was a trial placed upon him by God. He grew up not as a boy, but as a vessel of doom, carrying the expectation of collapse. The burden twisted him. In moments of clarity, he spoke with a kind of desperate resignation, admitting that perhaps God had chosen him for no other purpose than to end what had been built. But in darker hours, he raged against ministers, against his own body, even against heaven. "Why," he once cried, "was I born king if not to rule?" But prophecy gave no answer. It only watched and waited, its words repeating like an echo in every hall of the Alcazar. He will be the last. And so, Spain drifted deeper into paralysis. For who could act with conviction when the end was foretold? Who could plan for tomorrow when the stars themselves declared that tomorrow belonged to another dynasty? The crown weighed heavy, but heavier still was the prophecy that wrapped itself around Charles's throne, a curse not of sorcery, but of destiny.
While Spain wrestled with whispers of curses and the chains of prophecy, its enemies waited patiently beyond the Pyrenees. France, under the iron hand of Louis XIV, cast the longest shadow. The Sun King's gaze never left Madrid. He saw not a kingdom, but a carcass slowly weakening, its bones ready to be picked clean. Through diplomacy and spies, through war and marriage alliances, Louis prepared for the day the Spanish throne would fall vacant. His claim came through blood, through his marriage to Charles's half-sister, Maria Theresa. France was ready to insist that the next king of Spain should be a Bourbon. Austria, too, sharpened its claws. The Habsburg branch across the Alps believed Spain belonged to them by divine right. They saw Charles not as a king, but as a bridge to reclaim the empire their forefathers had once ruled. Every cough, every seizure he endured was noted by Vienna as a step closer to their inheritance. And so the court of Madrid became a nest of foreign ambassadors, each weaving their web. French envoys whispered in ears. Austrian agents sowed promises. English and Dutch diplomats lurked, calculating how to prevent one power from growing too strong. In taverns, soldiers muttered that Spain would not choose its next king, the world would. Inside the palace, the tension was unbearable. Charles, frail and childless, became the center of a global chess match. Every decision he made, whom he favored, whom he married, whom he trusted, was weighed as a move in this greater game. His body, too, was watched as though it were a battlefield. A fever in Madrid could stir war in Europe. The Spanish people sensed it. They saw their once mighty empire shrinking, their silver fleets plundered, their armies weary. They prayed for strength, for a miracle, for a child to be born that might silence foreign ambition. But heaven remained silent. Enemies pressed from outside, while inside the court rotted with faction and fear. Spain was a fortress with crumbling walls, and beyond those walls the enemies at the gate waited with patience sharpened like a blade. For they knew, when Charles II fell, Europe itself would tremble.